data. Okay, we are in the process of step 2, and that is reviewing the data and developing, basically aggregating it and developing where all the consensus is among states. And then the next step is to go back and present the consensus that we developed to the stakeholders. And the stakeholders group will be, again, made up of industry professionals, compost manufacturers, state regulators, industry consultants. And then once they review, they will vet the changes, and then we will have a final product. And then the final product will be then circulated online through our website, as well as sent out to all the state regulatory agencies across the nation. So the next thing is the different phases. After going through the existing document, we noticed that exemptions were not really detailed. There's a lot of different issues with exemptions. Some of the small scale community composting was not really up and running back in 2012. So that's one area that we saw that needed to be updated, as well as some of the ag exemptions that are out there now too. Definitions, it's always good to have solid, and I'll go through these one by one. A lot of states don't even have annual reporting requirements, and that is really for data collection. And that's really ideal not only for the state to track how much organic materials and source separated organic materials are being kept out of the landfill, but also how much of that compost is being sold in the market within that state. So there's a lot of issues around reporting requirements, and a lot of states have reporting requirements, but they're not aggregating the data, and they're not presenting the data where it's available to not only the state constituents, but also the industry. We'd like to know more about state by state what's going on. I'm sure the EPA would also like to know what that information is, because it could have a huge impact on greenhouse gas reduction. And we'd like to know tonnage in, tonnage out, or cubic yards in, cubic yards out. And then also training and certification. Some states require that you have a trained operator, and then also just recently, some states are actually requiring that operator not only be trained, but also certified. And then finally, product testing. Some states have a lot of information on product testing, and some don't have any at all. So these are areas that we felt were in need of updating. So I'll go through these different phases. So some of the questions we asked in this survey are, what feedstocks are exempted? Is it based on volume? Is it based on frequency? Is there an ag exemption? Is it based on footprint? A lot of these small scale community some states have adopted, okay, you can't be more than an acre in size and footprint, or you can only process 100 tons annually. So they're giving the volume and the frequency as well as the footprint of the site itself. Same thing with ag exemptions. For example, in North Carolina, you're exempt if you generate material on site and you're a farmer and you compost that material on site and you use that compost on site, then you're exempt from permitting. However, if you bring feedstocks from off-site, that will trigger getting a composting permit. And then again, it depends on the type of permit, what feedstock that you're handling, whether it's just green waste, or whether it's manures, or whether it's food waste or biosolids. A lot of the states within the yard waste or green waste category of feedstocks have a permit by rule, and that's based under again a certain volume and a certain frequency, but we want to know what those frequencies are, what those volumes are, so we can come up with a common denominator that other states can use in updating their rules. The second phase is definitions. And again, there's a lot of new definitions. The US Composting Council and the a group called APCO, which is Plant Professionals, which really reports on a national level of state regulators, people that regulate the product compost and fertilizers. There was an old definition in there. It went back to the 1950s. So we worked with them to update that definition, and we'd like to see that definition now being used really across the board in the U.S. So we'd like to try to standardize the feedstock nomenclature and definitions of feedstocks, because some people will say yard waste is green waste and green waste is not yard waste, and vice versa. So that's an issue. And then, just a lot of the other things that are out there, like the word compostable, we see that that's used a lot and exchanged with the word biodegradable, and obviously they're not the same. And then a lot of issues around curing, what is the definition of curing? What's the definition of maturity? And a lot of this is based on test data, on what we call test methods for composting and compost production, which was in the 1990s and is still in effect today. And we actually base the U.S. Composting Seal of Testing Assurance Program on the TMEX standards. So again, just a lot of just taking stuff, boil it down, getting more concise definitions that people can use, so there's not so much interchanging of words from state to state. The third phase is reporting requirements, and again, some states are doing a real good job on this, to the point where they're actually given GPS coordinates, they're actually tracking tipping fees, and then just all sorts of breakout of feedstock type. An example would be in North Carolina. When you do your annual report, you have to put in the feedstock type, the tonnage by month, and actually by county that you collected. If you're collecting it outside a county that you're in, then because those reports go back to the county managers, and they want to know how much organic material is being diverted to composting, and then how much compost is sold. And then also, where is that information stored? How often is it updated? Is it available to the public? And those things, again, a lot of times they'll do the reporting, they will aggregate the report, but they don't make that report available to the public. So very important to start getting that information and really getting it more into a format that's easy to do for the operator, and also easy for the state agency to be able to collect. I know originally I've been in this business, we'd have to do paper forms and send them in, and then you never knew where the aggregate information would be. Now with the advent of PDF files and computer databases, it's a lot easier for the input of information and also the output of information. Phase 4 is training and certification. And again, this is by facility type, whether it's yard waste, source separated, or biosolids. Obviously, if you look at the existing model rules template, a lot of it is based in really three types of facilities. One being, green waste or yard waste. Two being source separated organics, and that would include food waste and manures. And then type 3 facilities would be considered biosolids. So it's a little bit easier to manage a yard waste facility, and the knowledge base is not as important as it would be if you're trying to manage a biosolids facility, and even more a source separated organic facility, because you're getting a lot of different mixed materials that are coming in, and you have to manage the front end of that site with the back end of the site and your inventory. And a lot of times, I mean, we have composters that'll take spoiled milk, greases and fats, and to handle liquid materials and stuff like that, it's very difficult. So your recipes have to be really you have to be sharp at adjusting your recipes, adjusting your carbon pretty much on the fly. And then you have the seasonality of yard waste coming in and yard waste not coming in. So being able to stockpile. So it becomes real important. And really having a trained and certified operator on the site makes it a lot easier for regulators to regulate. A lot of the issues with composting facilities really across the nation are, fires, odor, dust, safety issues could be taken care of if you have trained certified operators on site. So we're a proponent that states adopt that into their rules. I think it'll make life a lot easier for everybody, and it'll definitely raise the bar for the industry. The question is, what curriculum is required? Well, getting back to the facility type, if it's a yard waste facility, you're probably going to cover safety. You're going to cover your pathogen kill requirements and your turning requirements and managing your feedstock coming in. And it'll probably more based on health and safety and creating for your customers to purchase. When you get up into source separated organics and biosolids, it gets a lot more complicated. So your curriculum is going to be a lot more robust. And we feel that not only should you be trained, but you should take a test. And after you take that test, you should have to go back and get certification credits. And a lot of wastewater treatment plants and drinking water plants and other industries that handle either residuals are really, they either are licensed operators or they're trained certified operators, and they have to get recertified, a certain number of hours each year. So we feel, again, that adds a lot more professionalism to the industry, and it also a lot of the issues that are out there currently. And then there's phase 5, and it has to do with product testing. A lot of states will say you have to test every 3,000 cubic yards, or you must test quarterly. And then, what parameters are you testing for? A lot of states have adopted the EPA 503 regulations, which were developed back in the early 90s for biosolids. And those are really around really 2 areas, heavy metals being the big issue, and then pathogens. So some states have just said, okay, if you are going to sell your product, you need to meet the EPA heavy metal limits, and you have to meet the EPA pathogen limits. So that's great. That's kind of good for, the basic health and safety of your product, and knowing that you're not going to contaminate things, and you're not going to also get people sick with pathogens. So, but to go beyond that, if you're looking at getting into more specialty markets, which the compost industry is getting a lot more sophisticated with specialty blends for anything from golf courses to green infrastructure, biosolids, bioswales, bioretention basins, green roofs. Your product is going to have to be tested for a lot more than just the metals and the pathogens. You have to look at pH, you have to look at maturity, stability, particle size. So there's a lot more involved in that. And for the consumer standpoint, it's always good to know that, the product is being tested on a regular basis and being tested by an accredited lab as well. And then some states have just adopted the U.S. Compost Council Seal of Testing Approval Program, which covers a lot of different parameters and including the pathogen and the metal parameters that you would need as a requirement for if your state adopted the EPA 503s. So again, a lot of this is, again, just trying to get more continuity within the industry across the country, state by state. A couple things that are also missing that are not really part of the permit itself, but it's really part of the management or the operations management of the facility. So we can pull that out, and we really look at that more as a best management practices guide. Years ago, there was a compost facility operating guide. It's out of print now. It was very much an engineering type document. Obviously, it was drawn up by an engineer. So when you read through it, it's very much a process flow. And what we want to do with that document is update it with some of the more recent issues that are out there, so facilities are managed a lot more sound. And we have what we call a best management practices guide that we're going to be working on. So, what some of the big issues, I'm sure the state regulators that are on the webinar now are coming up against these water management. And when I mean water management, I mean not just stormwater management, but moisture management, moisture in your windrows, in your dry areas. How do you add moisture? How do you add moisture without contaminating and having to restart your clock on your PFRP? What are your sources of water? What we call processed water or contact water, and then stormwater separately, where you have clean areas of the site. It's basically considered stormwater, where you have contact water within raw materials like manure or biosolids. Then those areas, should be separated, and that water should be either recirculated or should be treated in some manner. A lot of the odor management issues are around moisture, too much moisture, not enough air. Also, your feedstock mix, having too much nitrogen, not enough carbon, having small airspace, not enough air. If you have an aerated static pile system, you may not be providing enough air. The porosity of the mix may be too tight. So those are big issues. And then fire prevention, we're seeing a lot of fires occurring across the country, and a lot of these have to do with just managing your both your feedstocks as well as your finished product areas. A lot of these could be prevented by movement, just moving your piles. A lot of fires start with stagnant piles when you have low moisture and just the right amount of mass. So if your piles are lower and you're rotating your piles and you're moving your stock, both your feedstock and your finished product, you don't get into a situation where you may cause a fire. However, some nth degree and said you need to go and take temperatures on all your stockpiles, so that you're not going to reach a point where you're going to get spontaneous combustion. However, a lot of times you don't have probes big enough to get into where that fire is occurring. So a lot of it, again, this is a very much a materials management business, and knowing what to move, when to move, knowing your incoming materials, how much space you have, and not over committing and taking in materials that you can't manage, because that's always another issue. And then just recently, and a lot of this is just around really two issues: physical contamination. A lot of that is coming in with yard waste, people raking their yards, curbside collection, and then also food scrap with materials that say they're compostable, but they're actually not compostable. Very hard to determine the difference between the two, and it's very hard to separate those two from a physical standpoint. And when you're going to do that, it's very much a program that you have to do upstream as well as downstream to remove those physical contaminants. And then chemical contaminants. Just recently, really over the past, I want to say 10 years, we've seen issues with persistent herbicides affecting finished compost product, and these are detrimental in parts per billion. They're hard to detect coming in. We've tried to talk to chemical manufacturers about changing their labels and limiting the use of these products. However, they do make their way in to composting facilities. A needle in a haystack that you can't test for these coming in, and you can't test for them going out because you don't know where they are in your system. And then just recently, you've probably heard the acronym PFAS, and these are basically Teflon-like chemicals that are in the environment. They come from a lot of different sources. Some of it comes from the compostable packaging, although that's probably not going to happen anymore because most of the producers, manufacturers of those products have eliminated PFAS from their ingredients. So starting in 2020, you'll probably see less or none of that coming from that source. But a lot of it is just in the environment from, Scotchgard on your carpet, using Teflon pans, firefighting foams. These all have these chemicals in it, and they're very they're pervasive. They do not break down. And again, those would be very hard to control. So working on a best management practices guide to basically dovetail into the model rules template 2.0. I guess we could open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Very timely presentation, as I know that many high schools, colleges, and universities are now starting composting programs. We do have some questions. I think we have 5 right now, but if anybody else has some questions, just remember to put it in the chat box and then I can ask Frank directly. So the first question that we had, do the exempt sites need any other permit such as water and air?
Again, it depends on the state. And usually if it's an exempt site, it's probably low volume, or it's an ag based. So it probably has enough surrounding land where it's not an issue. Or if it's a small site, then it's probably more of a local issue. And a good example would be like a community composting site where you do have material coming in, but that material is either covered or there's buffer area for stormwater runoff between where the compost is being made or manufactured, and then down. This has to do with how you set up your site, how you site your site, what the slope of that site is, where the drainage is going. I think if you look at the picture that's up there, you see that most of those rows are draining to 1 or 2 points, or collection ponds, 3 collection ponds. So again, depends on the state, and usually the feedstock and the local municipality may have some jurisdiction over it. But in most cases, if it's exempt, you're not gonna see air or water permitting. Of course, California is always the exception.
Okay, thank you, Frank. And the next question that we do have is, who provides phase 4 training?
So again, a lot of states have training programs. The ones that we've looked at are usually 3-day trainings. The the Compost Foundation, which is really doing the training now, the USCC was doing the training, and that was all turned over to our foundation, which is a research and education foundation, which makes sense to put the training in the education foundation. They have a 5-day course. That's the one I think you're going to see in Nebraska. And a lot of that has to do with what I just talked about, going through siting, stormwater management, water management in general, odor control. So a lot of states will require, if it's a biosolids permit, they'll require, the operator to have a residual training for wastewater treatment. Some of them will just say, okay, it's a biosolid that's being composted. However, the majority of the feedstocks are considered solid waste. An example would be a biosolids facility that's taking in 2,000 tons of biosolids, but 10,000 tons of yard waste. That would fall under a solid waste permit. So a lot of states will require both, and some states will just say you need to be trained, in this area, and then the curriculum should cover these topics.
Okay, next question. Is there a compact list of compost regulations by state or federal?
Yes, federal requirement. So the only federal requirement is biosolids, and that is the EPA 503 regulations, which you can Google and get those. The state by state regulatory contacts are on the USCC website, compostingcouncil.org, and you could just go up in the top right-hand corner and search regulations, and then you could search by state. We update that every other year, and so we'll be updating it again this year. We didn't update it last year. So some of those, links may be broken, or some of the contacts that are, some of the email contacts may not be there, but most of the information, it's only about a year and a half old. So that's where you go for information on your specific state. Any other questions, Ben?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Right.
Next question is, what is a recommended buffer for an urban community composting site in a densely populated city like New York or Los Angeles?
Good question. A lot of this has to do with zoning. So the first thing you need to do is check the zoning. Is you probably have to get a special use permit, be through a solid waste permit. And a good example would be like if you wanted to put a recycling facility in a neighborhood like that, you would have to get a special use permit. In most cases, you're not going to see within a city, you're not going to see a large windrow composting facility. The ones that are in inner cities are usually undercover. They're aerated, and the exhaust air is going to a biofilter. So it's a highly engineered facility, and obviously the more brick and mortar, the more engineering, the higher the cost. So on a small scale, you'll see some of these community composting facilities where they're in these inner cities where there's abandoned lots and abandoned land. A good example of that is up in Cleveland, the Rust Belt Riders, who just recently received an award from us this year for compost manufacture, small scale, where they're doing it on a smaller scale. So yeah, it's very hard to get these facilities sited within an inner city unless they're undercover and they've got aeration and if that air is going to a biofilter.
Okay, thank you, Frank. We do have a couple more questions. We do have a few colleges and universities on the webinar. So a question is there a curriculum standard across all states? And then the second part to that question is what would be the key skills in the training to get certification?
Yeah. So a good question. First of all, the USCC worked with post landfill action network, which the acronym is PLAN. We worked with them on a campus composting guide. If you go to our website, and it's available there. I think that'll help you guys if you wanted to get programs started at your campuses. That's a good startup guide. So what the USCC, I mean, this is the purpose of really this going out and finding out what the states require, is to find that common denominator across the board. Okay. And the ones that I just off the top of my head that I know of, health and safety, understanding how to manage feedstocks, equipment, recipe development. And again, when I'm talking about these type of things, I'm talking about source separated organics, not just yard waste. So those are the big things. Troubleshooting, odor control, water management. Those are all big things. Those are all covered in the COTC Compost Operations Training Course that the foundation puts on. The USCC has a certification program where you need a minimum of 30 hours of those subjects' topic training, as well as being in the industry for 1 year, and then you have to pass a test. So that's what we call the Certified Operator Training Course. So that's those are the things that I think are important. University level, you could probably minimize that. We are working on trying to come up with a 1-day type training for universities to kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we're going to try to get together with ASHE and present that. I believe their conference is in Milwaukee in the fall. So we've got a call in a couple of weeks to talk to them about the possibility of doing that type of training for universities.
Okay, thank you. Also, I do want to mention if there is some folks from Nebraska on this webinar, we do have some employees from NDEE that are also on this webinar, and you can feel free to reach out to them with any questions. It's Blaine, Belinda, or Eric, and that would be on the NDEE .ne.gov website. And then another thing I did want to mention is the Nebraska Recycling Council is hosting the composting training beginning a compost operations training course beginning in early August at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and that will be on the East Campus. So if you're interested in that training, feel free to reach out to Heather Crevan or go to the Nebraska Recycling Council website for more information on that. I think they're still working out the final details of date and time, but it will be in early August. But other than that, I think that's all we have for questions. I want to thank you, Frank, for your time. And then if you want to you have an email or a contact slide where we could reach out to you?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to compostcouncil.org, and all my information's on there. It's Franciosi@compostingcouncil.org. But I can get that information to you, as well as the information for the university guide for composting, and then the link to the regulatory, where you can find your state regulatory information.
Okay, yeah, that would be very useful for uh, some of the people on this call. I do want to mention as well that we are having this presentation and this webinar was recorded, and we have a YouTube channel. It's just cccneb.edu/SLPS. And this presentation the video will be posted in about a week after we do some minor edits. So that will be available for all of you to view. And then we'll also have Frank's contact information on there, as well as Heather's. Other than that, thank you again, Frank. And our next SLPS will be March 5th at noon. Speaker to be determined, but I want to thank you all for your time and in viewing the SLPS.
Thank you.